And I want to make a point here because I think it's really important to look at the reserve currency of the world. The way that we do is a store of value for banks around the world. And then the policy that the Fed puts in place also impacts decisions made in other parts of the world. And that impacts the global economy. But and this is a conundrum that I spent a lot of time with in this book. I tried to understand how is it possible that we could have the reserve currency of the world, but at the same time have inflation.
The Financial Survival Network. Now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to watching the Financial Survival Network. Well, the person you're about to hear from, somebody whose work I have followed very closely for the past 12 years. This person I credit partly with me even choosing the path of, and often the lonely path, of free markets, of sound money, and of just so many other things that I've come to believe and endorse wholeheartedly. I know you want to know his name, and he's also got a special report for you at the end, Anatomy of a Bust, and the moment you've been waiting for, Addison Wiggin. Addison, your best-selling author. You've got the third edition out of Demise of the Dollar. There'll also be a link to that if you guys want to buy it. And
I have it in my hands.
and as you say, it covers everything from bailouts to the pandemic and beyond. We already know what's happened. I'm curious about what's going to happen. Hey, really, in this space, Addison, I'm not going overboard here with the flattery. You are a legend. You are a thought leader. And, we could get into the book, but I want to know, how did you get here? When was your awakening? Because Churchill said, or often it's said, that a Republican is just a Democrat is just a Republican who hasn't been mugged yet, or yeah. As Churchill said, if you're not 18 and a liberal, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative by age 40, you have no mind. Obviously, you had an awakening here. How did that happen?
Yeah, I like both of those quotes, and I actually think it was P.J. O'Rourke who said that if Republican or a Democrat is a Republican who hasn't been mugged yet, unless he was just paraphrasing. I don't know. But for me, it started. Ironically, and I have to tell this story every now and then because just because people ask me. But I actually studied literature, short American fiction in school, and then I studied philosophy in graduate school. So I studied religion, history, things like that. And just a lot of the things that were going on in the media. I was interested in publishing. I was interested in the things that I had been studying, but I was mostly interested in how ideas get conveyed to other people. And that became like a really important part of the study that I did. And I realized pretty early on when I was like, after I stopped following the Grateful Dead, for example, I realized that money was the only medium that we actually share in common. We have opinions, politics, different types of entertainment that we like to consume, but money is really the only medium that we all share, whether we like it or not. So I got really fascinated with the development of the Federal Reserve and the impact of the two world wars on the conversion of the British pound as the reserve currency of the world to the US dollar. I got fascinated by the entire idea of the gold standard when I was literally when I was studying philosophy. Like that was the beginning for me. Like I realized that there was something sort of awry about the way that the media conveys financial information and that kind of thing. And then I met Bill Bonner, who is the founder of Agora, a number of companies that come through. We call them the Agora companies, and he had actually studied law like you did. He studied law at Georgetown, and then came to some similar conclusions a decade before I did. And when he was explaining some of the concepts of how the economy works, free markets work, how they interact with politics, and the chicanery that goes on in Washington, it just made sense to me. It clicked, and I was a young man, and it just made sense to me that I just made it my career. I've been doing it for over 30 years now. So
yeah, I never looked back, I'm sure. So, I've kind of arrived at this concept of language, like communication, how we communicate thoughts, ideas. And as a lawyer, it's easier because you got one case, it's one little snippet of life. And it's a lot of times it's when you're before the court, it's like if you can get the judge to hate the other guy's, your adversary's client more than he hates yours, you'll win the case. And I found that was basically what was going on in society and communication, and like you with economic concepts, is by shooting the messenger, you can achieve your point without ever having to prove anything. And, I feel like that's where we're at now. I always go into, I don't watch media anymore. I don't watch news shows because I also realize that we're being biohacked effectively, but it's subtle. Like when you trigger somebody and you get them into an emotional state, they lose their ability to actually critically analyze the information they're receiving, and they accept it as truth. And that's a formula that works universally on the right, on the left, it doesn't matter. And once I realized that I was being biohacked effectively, info hacked, everything changed for me. And that's kind of why I got into this show, to try to make you understand how we got where we are, why these pieces are all moving in the way they are. I guess we kind of arrived in the same place from different channels, but here you are, you've written books, you've been publishing things about fiscal sanity, about why markets work best, free markets in economic systems, all of these things. And for 30 years, has the message gotten out? Is it getting out? Are people waking up? Or is it just the government's going to take care of everything?
So I can't answer that directly, because I feel like we've made a lot of progress, and also the networks that we've created. Like I meet people like you, who share similar opinions. I worked at Cato for a while, and they're publishing their economic. It's more like research. It's not very entertaining, but I feel like there is an awareness that didn't exist before, and the technology has changed. So you and I can talk over Zoom, and I do my own podcast or Zoomcast, the Wiggin sessions, and I do it for the same reasons that you're doing it, which is like I get to meet really interesting people, and we get to talk about things like this, and we're not beholden to a network or anything like that. So I think that's really important. And those changes have happened in my career, during my career. So I feel like decentralization of ideas is happening, but at the same time, I feel like there's a craving. I don't know how to say this properly, but there's a craving for one idea that we hold in common. And like I do watch the mainstream media because I want to know what they're saying, but it's mostly entertainment. Even the news is entertainment, and the snippets, like you don't actually learn anything unless you go and do the research yourself. Mostly what people consume as news, financial news, and just news about society and things like that. That doesn't actually happen through network media. It's awful. Um, but at the same time, I do think there's a democratization of ideas that's happening, and you and I are examples of that. Like I'm encouraged. I'm an optimist because I believe that we can continue to share ideas. I just don't trust the mainstream media that much, and for good reason, because they're they're beholden to corporate advertising, and I don't know. I watch it because I want to see what's going on. I want to see what they're thinking, but that doesn't mean I agree with that. If that was a kind of long-winded answer, it's changed a lot, and I have a lot of optimism. But at the same time, it's especially when it comes to like elections or wars or things that actually impact our lives. Inflation has been an issue that most people just don't understand at all. This whole book is about how the Fed created inflation, and then now they're pretending like they're champions of it. So
let's
there's a lot of issues that I just don't agree with when I watch it, but I want to know what they're saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with that, but I usually read it rather than watch it. I like to read it because reading in and of itself is a critical process, whereas watching is I can't do it. I can't. If they show a kid getting blown up in some war zone, and I'm like, I change. Body chemistry, brain chemistry, it all changes. But reading it, I can deal with it and keep the emotions in check. But that's just me. But I totally get, you want to know what the other side's thinking. You don't want to live in an echo chamber like many of the statists and collectivists live in a giant echo chamber where nothing contrary to their views can penetrate it.
And that's part of what I'm saying too, is that I did find myself, we've been publishers for many years of what we would call alternative financial advice. We're looking at economic trends and primary trends, things that are moving the markets, and we're making recommendations in that vein. But I did find myself creating my own echo chamber. And then I was repeating a lot of things that other people were saying, and I felt like I was thinking independently, but then I would read it from somebody else and be like, wait a minute, that's not exactly accurate. So I just changed my habits, and I do read a lot. I read a couple hours a day in the morning before I do anything, because I just want to know what other people think about what's happening in the world, and how that's going to impact the opinions that I have. And also when I have conversations like with you, I feel like I need to have a broader perspective on the way the world works, as opposed to the way that I think that it works.
Right. So talking about bringing it current, inflation. So magically the government will have you believe, or the whatever you want to call the status quo, the keepers of the status quo, the powers that be, is inflation just magically occurs from animal spirits or whatever. And I just harken back to the words of Milton Friedman. Inflation is first and foremost a monetary phenomena. Always. I mean, that was a categorical, absolute statement that I don't know how many of the people running stuff out there really ever comprehended that or took the time to even attempt to understand it.
Well, if you think about it, running either zero or close to zero interest rates for almost a decade, inflation is the natural outcome of that. Like, all you have to do is read a couple books, read some history, and that is what happens. If you pump money into the system, every dollar that gets published or printed is going to be worth less than the one before it. And because we have the reserve currency of the world, we're in a beneficiary position where we can make decisions that impact our own spending, and there's no guardrails for the Federal Reserve. so they can do whatever they want. If they want to run zero interest rate policy to shore up the banking system on Wall Street, which they did, it's going to lead to inflation, and then we export that inflation to the rest of the world. And that's what we just experienced in the period between 2020 and 2023. Is inflation was rampant in the US, and then we exported that to other parts of the world because the Federal Reserve, by virtue of our having the reserve currency status, was influencing the central bank policy of the European Central Bank, of Japan, of Australia. I just did a podcast with Gene Tunney, who's down in Australia, and he was effectively saying that even commodities prices that come out of Australia are affected by Federal Reserve policy decisions. Like it's a global system, whether we like it or not, whether we politically want to stop it or whatever, it does exist, and it impacts the currency that we spend. And I want to make a point here because I think it's really important to look at the reserve currency of the world. The way that we do is a store of value for banks around the world. And then the policy that the Fed puts in place also impacts decisions made in other parts of the world. And that impacts the global economy. But and this is a conundrum that I spent a lot of time with in this book. I tried to understand how is it possible that we could have the reserve currency of the world, but at the same time have inflation. And we have inflation because so many dollars were pumped into our own internal system. And the internal system is we have a payment currency. So we might have the reserve currency of the world, but we also have to pay for, I don't know, eggs became a big deal in 2020 or 2022. The price of the stuff that we spend our money on actually goes up. So our mortgages go up, our car payments go up, tuition goes up, the commodities that we consume, like natural gas and oil, that goes up. And the shipment for the goods that we consume, like eggs and I don't know, whatever, bread, wheat, like all of those things go up because there's more money going into the system. And I think that that's Milton Friedman's point, is inflation is at its core a monetary event. More money goes into the system, things cost more. It's not that much more complicated than that. And to address the point that you made, I think all the bankers are smart, and they didn't get to where they were because they don't understand basic economics. It's that they're playing a game. They're playing politics with our money, and I do the work that I do. I wrote the books. I have made documentaries on it. I did these things because I'm learning them myself, like my own my own journey through life. I'm understanding how to manage my own money, raise my own family. Like those things were important to me. So the most important thing that people can do, in my view, is understand the big trends. You can't really do anything about them, but you can understand them and then position your money, your personal money, accordingly. And that's the genesis of all the newsletters I've published and books I've written.
That is a great point. It just, you think it doesn't matter, but it does. I mean, when I figured out that economies generally went down when interest rates went up, recessions were triggered, I realized then when the Federal Reserve started raising rates, that my receivables out there on the street to attorneys and other businessmen were going to become worth less, harder to collect. So when I started seeing interest rate hikes happen, I did a full court push for the following 18 months, 6 to 18 months, get in all the money you can, offer prepayment discounts, whatever it takes. Try not to loan any money. Try not to keep receivables to an absolute minimum. That strategy actually served me pretty well. The other thing you mentioned, a decade of zero interest rate debt. That is the classic, what the Austrians refer to as malinvestment.
Mm-hmm.
And we got malinvestment in this country, but the malinvestment over in China dwarfs anything we've done here, you know?
Yeah, I think I'm a fan of the phrase that Warren Buffett has been famously connected with. When the tide goes out, we find out who's not wearing any bathing suit. And that's what happens. And that I'm glad you brought up the Austrian theory, because during the boom, that's when all the mistakes are made. We don't find out what the mistakes were. And I've seen this in my own business, in several of the businesses that I've been involved in, is you make a lot of mistakes when money's coming in. And if the money is coming in because of cheap interest rates, it makes it even worse because you make bad decisions. And then when the tide goes out, then you're like, those were bad decisions. And we all have to live with that. It's just, I wouldn't call it human nature. I would just say that we get excited when it looks like we're going to make a lot of money, and we do. And then we make functional decisions that undermine good investment practices. We all do it. And they I'm working on, in fact, the anatomy of a bust, the report that we've been talking about, or that we have available, is I started with Garrett, who wrote a piece called A Bubble That Broke the World in 1932. So he was writing in the middle of what we now call the Great Depression. The term Great Depression hadn't even been invented yet, especially with the capital G and D, because they didn't know what they were dealing with. But he wrote in 1932 that he analyzed the way that the banks had overinvested in technology. Like RCA gets pummeled in this argument because radio was new. Everybody gets excited about it. I think we're going through that right now with cryptocurrencies. Like the anatomy of the bust for us can be like the breadcrumbs go all the way back to decisions that were made about a year ago, trying to trade stable coins, which were supposed to be linked to the US dollar. And then the trajectory moves forward to the collapse of Alameda Research, and then FTX, and then tech entrepreneurs who are heavily invested in cryptocurrencies pulled their money out of banks like Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank. That's the story that I have. I'm not even done telling it, because we're right in the middle of it. It's still happening. And yeah, right. So that's what's in the report, but it's also going into the next edition of Financial Reckoning Day, because when we look back in history and we look at one of the things I do in Financial Reckoning Day is look at how the Mississippi scheme of John Law swindled an entire nation in France in 1715 was when it busted. But when you read those stories in history, you look back at, you're like, how is it possible that people thought that kind of thing? But it's happening right now, right in front of our face. This whole idea that cryptocurrency is going to change the way that we think about money is just crazy. It's a crazy idea. And now the SEC is involved. Just this morning, I think it was, or yesterday morning, the SEC is
Coinbase, right?
Coming down hard on Coinbase and also Binance. They're trying to nail those guys for fraud, really, is what they're investigating. I don't know if it's going to happen. And you know what? The SEC is no friend of mine either. So
yeah, same here. Well, I call them kleptocurrencies because maybe Bitcoin's great and stable coins and Ethereum, but why do we need thousands of them? They made absolutely no sense.
Yeah, but you know what? It's very interesting. If you're a student of economic history, Like in the 1830s and 40s, we had wildcat banks, and they were just printing money just like the Fed does today. But there were thousands of banks that were printing their own money. Like cryptocurrency is no different. We pretend because we understand, or we're enamored by technology. And I am too, because I love being able to have this conversation with you over Zoom.
Sure.
Like I think a lot of the technological advances that we get excited about are really important, and I do think that blockchain is also important. But it leads to all kinds of weird imaginary things. Like the currency is going to be currency. It was seashells at one point, or it was,
Right.
I don't know, ox bones, and then it became gold and silver or whatever. Like nothing's really going to change the idea of currency. And I don't think that our technological advances are going to do that either. But we do have to understand it, and we have to use it properly.
What they shouldn't be called cryptocurrencies anyway, because they lack a lot of the concepts, the principles of a currency, like store of value. You could argue one way or the other, but they're divisible. Obviously, they're portable, but they're not really. It's not a medium of exchange, right? It never fulfilled that promise. And if it's not a medium of exchange, if I can't go to Starbucks and buy my overpriced latte with crypto, not that I necessarily want to, but if I can't do it, then it's not a currency. It's an asset class, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that that's correct. But I also, just in thinking about it for myself, I do believe that the technology that underlies it, blockchain, I think that's going to make banking more efficient, and it's going to be a positive outcome. But like any time you introduce a new technology into society, it comes with a bunch of just shenanigans, like mostly fraud is what happens. But get excited. I'll just tell the story of John Law just really quickly because I think it's hilarious. He introduced paper currency to the Bank of France. He himself was the son of a gold smith in Scotland, and during his teen and 20s, like teen years and 20, when he was in his early 20s, the Bank of Scotland took all the coins that they could gather and shipped them over to the Isthmus of Panama. They took the actual coins with them because they were going to go start a colony over there, and they depleted the actual currency that people were using in Scotland at the time. And the ship sank. So they lost all their money.
That could ruin your
John Law grew up in an environment where the species, the actual coins that people use to buy wheat and make bread or whatever, disappeared. And so he came up with the idea of printing money to replace species, the actual printed coins, so that he could. The idea was actually a good one, is that people could use it to buy bread or whatever.
Portability.
And then he went and he convinced he created the Bank of France to help finance the wars that were happening in France at the time. And he convinced the Duc d'Orléans, who was running the country at the time, to found the Bank of France. And then they were trading these paper dollars in the streets. There are two things they were trading were the franc, which is their currency, but they were also trading the banknotes in the streets of Paris. And the only way to keep that con game going long enough was John Law convinced the public that they were going to go and mine this gold on the island of Mississippi in the New World. And that's why it became the Mississippi Scheme. And what he did to convince everyone was he rounded up all the bums and vagrants who were living in Paris at the time, people with no money. He gave them shovels and hats and stuff like that so that they would look like miners. And he marched them from Paris to Nantes, where they were supposed to get on ships and go to the New World and mine this gold. And it worked for a while. But then it went bust because those same bums and vagrants and the people that were still not, they didn't have any money, they started showing up in the same places in Paris again. And he ended up getting, he was the richest man in the world at the time because he had come up with this scheme, but he ended up getting chased out of Paris, you know, the horses with the carriage, but people were trying to break the carriage down, and he stole a bunch of artwork on the way. It's a very interesting story, but the reason I'm telling it now, and the reason why I still find it fascinating, is the advent of paper currency had actually happened in China 500-600 years before that. But when they introduced it to Paris, it became this object of like fascination. And it was only maybe 20 years after the tulip bubble in the Netherlands. And then the British government created this LC bubble right after that because they mimicked what John Law had done. So this kind of like financial fascination and belief in imaginary economic progress has been with us forever.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's McKay's book, Popular Delusion and the Madness of Crowds. And
I did a lot of when I was writing Financial Reckoning Day, I looked at the sources that McKay used, and I went and read those. So like the story is pretty deep. And then what I'm trying to do now is just show that the cryptocurrency bubble and collapse, and there's still a ton of people that think it's going to replace the US dollar or whatever. Yeah, it's just another innovation of technology into the financial system. But the idea of a currency has to have some confidence behind it. Otherwise, it becomes an object of speculation and fraud.
Well, you know, the root of the word confidence is con, right?
Yeah.
That's what I always say. Hey,
well, I say that about the Fed too, though. It's like the most historic con game that's ever been run.
So I'm going to go change up a little. So when you're in the midst of a bull market, of a speculative frenzy, like when you watch your Bitcoin go up from $5 to 5,000, 15,000, all right, there's a biochemical shift that takes place in your body. Dopamine, there's nothing that can generate dopamine more than returns in financial markets. And the dopamine, you know, goes to the pleasure center, and you're getting pleasure from it. And it's very difficult to, and I've been in this position myself during the .com, where I sit back and I make $30,000 in a day off of a relatively small portfolio and look around at my office and say, why am I bothering to work here? Like, what's the point of this? And, you know, you just get carried away. And for somebody who's been through it 4 or 5 times, like myself, I can self-regulate. But for some millennial or Gen Zer out there who gets their first taste of literally dopamine on demand, they can't do that. They don't have the experience to self-regulate.
Yeah, I think that's the importance of shows like yours, and what I'm trying to do with Wiggin sessions is I've been through it now 3 times, and I've done well, and then I've not done well, and I've done well, and then I've not done well. Like, I think part of it is just communicating, like, don't get carried away. and that's why we try to put guardrails on. I have a product that I call the Essential Investor, and it's these books that I'm writing are a part of the bedrock of what I want the essential investor to convey to people, which is this one, Demise, is about fiat currencies and the failure of fiat currencies throughout history. Financial Reckoning Day is about booms and busts, like we were just talking about, with the advent of new technologies that change the psychology of the market. And then Empire of Debt is the third one. And that is mostly about the politics of how the U.S. has been carried away by these financial innovations and allowed itself to get indebted to the degree that it is now. $31 trillion is crazy. And I made some movies on it. Most notably, IOUSA was nominated for an Academy Award, or shortlisted, I guess they call it. And then we were also in the Sundance Film Festival, and it was about we're in the throes of just insane fiscal policy, and also the way that people think about their own lives when they get swept up by investing in Wall Street. That there is a disconnect between reality of managing the finances of the country or managing your own credit. We're mostly a credit-driven society now. And when you try to explain that to people are like, oh yeah, I get it. And then they turn around and they look for that dopamine rush. And so having lived through it like you have, having lived through it a couple times, I think communication is the most important thing. Like, I've been really excited about my own returns on several occasions. And then I've also been in situations where I'm like, oh shit, what did I do? So
that is the best lesson. And
yeah. And so the only thing we can really do, there's no real level of education other than experience. So all we can do is talk about our experience, and then hopefully people will listen. And the idea behind Essential Investor, what I'm trying to do is just, take the wisdom from you, from my own experience, from Warren Buffett, from any number of people that are trying to manage their own money, and just make sure that we have sound approaches to investing and managing over time.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, Addison. It's been a 12-year struggle to get you on the show. I'm really happy you came.
It's kind of weird that it took 12 years, but
just one of those things. But
so if readers are interested in the boom bust theory, which I just talked about, they can look at an anatomy of a bust, because I've tried to take my work and apply it to what's happening with crypto and with the banking crisis that we just I don't think we're done with yet, but it grabbed the headlines until the debt ceiling debate. So they can get that report for free. It's called Anatomy of a Bust, and within it is information that you need to, if you want to sign up for Essential Investor. It's all in.
All right, excellent. Well, appreciate you coming on. And what's the best site to read your work these days? Actually,
the easiest way to get started is a site that we call the Wiggin Sessions, but jointhesessions.com gets you signed up for the podcast or Zoomcast, similar to your own, that we publish to our website. And then it also gives you access to the daily missive, which is just me writing about stuff like I'll write about you, for example. I'm going to talk about talking to you and the ideas that we discussed. So it's an email. It's just accessible way to talk about these same ideas.
All right. Hey, well, if you got a question for Addison, you can always shoot me an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. The link to get the free report, Anatomy of a Bust, it's in the show notes, as well as the link to buy the Demise of the Dollar. That's also there. And to join Addison's sessions, that link is in the show notes as well. And Addison, really appreciate your
comment. I appreciate you too.
All right. We'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
All right. Thank you, Kerry.